Hello, Super Relaxed Fantasy Club. This is Kenneth Cameron, sometimes known as Miles Cameron, talking to you from Toronto, Canada, where we also have COVID-19. I'm not wearing a mask at the moment because my camera person, assistant, and sometimes sword student Elizabeth Beattie, who you'll see later, and I are a good 15 feet away. And anyway, here's my COVID reading. I'm going to read to you from Cold Iron, which is not my latest novel, but it's the first book in my latest trilogy. And what I propose to do is to read you a fight scene, talk a little about it, and then Elizabeth and I hope, are going to act it out for you. Because the way I write sword scenes is sort of pivotal to how I write. And in fact, just probably too much information, I sort of thought through this scene before I had a book, almost as soon as I had a character. And here's why I'll set the scene. The main character, Aranther Timos, is a young man studying magic in the equivalent of a university in a sort of 16th or early 17th century alternate reality that is more Greek than, say, English or French. And I knew right off the bat that I didn't want him to be a great swordsman, that I actually wanted him to spend the books learning about sword fighting because I thought that would be more fun for readers. But I needed him to win a sword fight early on against a much better swordsman. And that caused me to spend a lot of mornings staring off into space thinking, how does a big, athletically okay person defeat a much better sword person in a fair fight with no cheating, no opportunity to cheat, no tactics, no swinging from chandeliers? And this is the fight scene I came up with. I think it's based on sound fencing tactics, and it's also based on the kind of mistakes that I see mid-grade and high mid-grade fencers make when they're sparring. And that's the kind of thing that charms me. So to set the scene, we're in the courtyard of an inn, and a master swordsman who is not involved in any of these fights has invited some very high quality swordsmen to fight in front of him as he's looking for a successor for his school. And in the process of pretty normal social interaction, Aranther Timos has managed to fall afoul of one of these brilliant students and now is going to fight in a duel as an 18-year-old, not particularly well-trained farm boy. "Are you ready, young man?" the magister asked. Aranther drew his sword and then took his buckler off his belt. "Bucklers?" De Silva asked. "What are we, savages?" The magister neither smiled nor frowned. He shrugged. "My principal has specified bucklers. Your second agreed." The local wheelwright, who'd probably never even seen a duel in his life, nodded. He was shaking harder than Aranther. Time passed while the magister sent a boy to fetch a buckler from his own baggage. Aranther found that he was not really there, and that the cold and the fear had to some extent cancelled each other out, leaving him in a place a little distance from himself, like a man on a hill watching the smoke from the chimneys of his beloved village below him. The sunrise foretold bad weather, a storm towards afternoon. It was the sort of thing a farmer noticed. "Perhaps I won't care," he suddenly thought. "Perhaps I will." Some of this calm had come from having determined what he would do. He was a half a head taller than this De Silva, and his own shoulders were broader. His sword was just as long, and he suspected his arms were longer. The man had 2 small wounds already, a cut on his forehead that kept bleeding and a cut on his sword arm. "He's arrogant," Aranther thought, "and he has no idea how strong I am." Eventually the buckler appeared, and the Westerner, now obviously suffering from the cold, grasped it. Only then did Aranther slip his coat off and pull his shirt over his head so that he was naked to the waist. The magister of physic at the academy had said that cloth carried more dirt into the wound than any other substance. He was a farm boy. He'd worked with no shirt on every winter morning of his life until he went to the city. "I'm ready," he said. "Guard," the magister said. He sounded bored. Aranther's guard was very different from his opponent's. He stood with his sword pointing almost straight behind him, and his buckler advanced as far as he could reach. De Silva's sword was practically under his eye, which made him afraid all over again. But having a plan seemed a wonderful thing, and it gave him hope. His sword was a long way from De Silva, but he knew that he was fast, and the Westerner could see neither his sword nor the arm that held it. He had no notion of the distance, the length of Aranther's arm, or the length of his sword. That was his only advantage. Without a buckler, the stance would have been suicidal. The first blow would almost certainly outrace any guard or cover that a Ranther could throw, and he'd be dead. But the buckler changed the option in every guard. "Begin," the magister said. De Silva wasted no time, probably due to the cold. He leapt forward as soon as the handkerchief dropped, his back right leg powering his left leg and torso forward, a feint to draw the buckler and a powerful thrust. A Ranther's plan went out the window in half an instant. But his buckler remained in place and his sword joined it, a crisp beat off the other blade. He didn't step back. The Westerner turned his parried thrust into a cut with a wrist roll. A Ranther covered the low attack to his leg by withdrawing the leg. His sword seemed to be fighting all by itself. That is, he knew all these attacks and defenses, but he wasn't thinking them. His sword, reacting to the leg cut, was too slow, but the enemy weapon whistled past his leg, wrenched out of the way just in time. He countercut, as he'd been taught, a backhand blow to De Silva's temple that arose naturally from the failed parry. His opponent leapt back. He continued his cut all the way back to the guard in which he'd begun, the sword all the way outstretched behind him, mostly because that's how the drill he'd learned in school worked. But finding that he had put his sword there, and that withdrawing his leg had thrown all his weight forward, he attacked without any more conscious thought than he had defended. He threw a heavy blow, the one with which he had intended to begin the fight, a simple, shoulder-level, flat cut that came from behind his back and, powered by the whole weight of his hips and legs, snapped around like a scythe cutting wheat. De Silva snapped up his parry, a turn of his sword hand, and immediately counter-hit with a thrust. A Ranther felt the stinging pain and the cold of the sword, and then the other man fell to the ground, clutching his neck, blood spurting into the snow and slush. De Silva gave a garbled scream, and his body arched with pain. A Ranther felt the pain in his own neck and the cold, and he went down on one knee. He was afraid to touch his neck. His vision tunneled, and he could see the Westerner flopping in the muck of the yard. Then there were hands under his armpits and a cold hand on his neck. "It's nothing," his friend Lekney said. "Blessed son!" "Nothing?" he asked. His heartbeat was calming. He had some control of himself. His vision returned. His gorge went down. He pushed himself to his feet, shaking off the hands on him. Blood was flowing down his naked torso. De Silva was losing blood at the rate of a dying deer on a winter afternoon. And the men in the yard were letting him die. Even the magister. A Ranther focused. His earlier clarity was shredded, and he sought it again, the hyper-awareness. "Hold him," he shouted. The sun was rising, and he reached out to it for comfort and power. "Stand away," the magister said, misunderstanding. "You are the winner. Now he cannot defend himself." "Hold him," a Ranther said, in something of his namesake's voice of power. He struggled for his ritual, and once he found the peace of his words, he struggled the harder for his trance, and under his right hand the man was dying. The dying soaked into him like blood, and he couldn't make it through the mud and the blood to the calm place where the magic lay. He tried image after image. He sighed, opened his eyes, and was looking directly into the sun as it crested the distant eastern horizon, a perfect ball of red gold. In a single exhalation, he had his trance, and he made the working. He didn't know how to knit muscle and bone, but he did know how to tell the skin and the muscle to forbid the flow of blood, and he so ordered his opponent's body, and it obeyed. He took a deep breath. It felt right. He opened his eyes, and then he was kneeling in the snow and the blood, utterly spent. Lekney helped him up, and he saw they were carrying the Westerner inside. The magister was standing with his hands on his hips. A Ranther couldn't make himself smile, and he couldn't think of anything witty to say. So, there's a completely inexperienced person. He's not completely inexperienced. He's had like 20 lessons, facing an experienced swordsman who makes an arrogant mistake, under-parries a heavy blow, and almost dies for it. And if you do HEMA, or any other form of martial arts, you can watch experienced students make these mistakes all the time. I wonder how different it would be if our lives were on the line. And as an experienced fencer, I often watch my students, or even myself, and wonder, would we take these chances if these things were sharp? But I have to base my writing on something, and I wrote this scene based on actual engagement that I watched one of my most senior instructors and a relatively junior person undertake. And I think it's good fun, and it also tells you a lot about a Ranther's character. And I'm just going to throw in this one little comment for people who write. and that is that I love writing fight scenes, especially sword fights. But I don't worship violence. I don't think many of us do. And I view a good violence scene exactly the way I view a good sex scene. I think it should sell the character. It should tell you something that you didn't know before about the character. I like to think that out of that scene, you know Aranther better. You know that he's almost ridiculously brave under pressure. You know that he is a thinking person, and you know he's big and strong, and he's a farm kid. That seems pretty good from a fight scene. So, thanks for watching. The rest of this video will be shot in my back alley in the time of COVID, and hopefully we'll show you the guards they used and a little bit of the action. We're going to be doing it very slow. We're not going to be wearing a ton of protective gear. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you all stay safe and well in London, and I get to see you again soon. Thanks very much. So now we're in the sword part of the video. First thing I'm going to do is talk about the weapons that I believe that Aranther and his various friends and enemies, adversaries, opponents, and guests are using in the Cold Iron series. So first of all, this is what we call an arming sword. It's not a rapier. It's got a pretty wide blade so that you can actually cut with it all the way down. You can see that eventually it's going to be a rapier. You can see where rapier is going to come out of this. This is called a complex hilt. It's just beginning to be good at covering the hand. And you'd be surprised if you're used to using one of these, how much cover this one ring and these finger rings actually cause. And the finger rings mean that you can put your fingers through the rings, or you can put your thumb along the back of the blade. And that grip change is something Aranther has no idea how to do. So I'll try not to do that in this video. That would be advanced sword work. This is a buckler. Probably the first thing you're going to say to yourself is, that's a really small shield. Like, how do you protect yourself with this shield? And this is one thing that Aranther already knows from his 10 fencing lessons. I'm going to give you one of these lessons right here. So here I am with a buckler, and if I hold it right here, I can protect my heart, or like my face, or the top of my head. But see, if I hold it right here, I'm covering an awful lot of target area from your perspective, right? And that little ability to turn it out and turn it in is all I need. And by the way, the guard I'm in right now, that's the guard Aranther starts the fight in. So in our world, in Renaissance Italy, Aranther's guard was called Codalonghi Distesa, at least by Marazzo. And that means that it's like a long tail. The sword is held out behind you and the buckler right in front. And you may notice, I hope you notice, that when you look at me right now, you can't really see my sword or my arm. And like Aranther, I have really long arms. And I'm about to demonstrate, hopefully not destroying my friend's camera, by showing you that from this position, I can throw a very fast cut to there. And that's what Aranther wants to do. That's his plan. We're now going to show you a couple of things about the fight, and you're going to see how fast it is. Not that we're going to go very fast, but that real sword fights don't last very long because people make mistakes super quickly. So we want to show you how this worked. I have two friends here. You can't see them both at the moment, but we have Kate, who's going to read aloud to us so that we don't make mistakes, and we have Elizabeth, who's going to help me, I hope, with the sword part. And hopefully we'll stumble through this in time that you can all get to dinner. Ciao.
Hi, I'm Kate McLean. I'm going to be reading the passage from Cold Iron today. I also happen to do a lot of the paintings for sale on Christian's website. I'm an artist. If you're interested in any of those paintings, it'd make us both very happy to see them out in the world. Now for the reading. Aranther's guard was very different from his opponents. He stood with his sword pointing almost straight behind him, and his buckler advanced as far forward as he could reach. De Silva's sword was practically under his eye, which made him afraid all over. But having a plan seemed a wonderful thing and gave him hope. His sword was a long way from De Silva, but he knew he was fast, and the Westerner could see neither his sword nor the arm that held it. He had no notion of the distance, the length of Aranther's arm, or the length of his sword. This was his only advantage. Without a buckler, the stance would have been suicidal. The first blow would almost certainly outrace any guard or cover that Aranther could throw, and he'd be dead. But the buckler changed the options in every guard. "Begin," the Magister said. De Silva waited no time, probably due to the cold. He leapt forward as soon as the handkerchief dropped, his back right leg powering his left leg and torso forward, a feint to draw the buckler and a powerful forward thrust. Aranther's plan went out the window in half an instant, but his buckler remained in place and his sword joined it, a crisp beat off the other blade. He didn't give back. The Westerner turned his parried thrust into a cut with a wrist roll. Aranther covered the low attack to his leg by withdrawing the leg. His sword seemed to be fighting by itself. That is, he knew all these attacks and defenses, but he wasn't thinking them. His sword reacting to the leg cut was too slow, but the enemy weapon whistled past his leg, wrenched out of the way just in time. He countercut as he'd been taught, a backhand blow to De Silva's temple that arose naturally from the failed parry. His opponent leapt back. He continued his cut all the way back to the guard in which he'd begun, his sword all the way outstretched behind him, mostly because that's how the drill he'd learned worked. But finding that he'd put his sword there and that withdrawing his leg had thrown his weight forward, he attacked without any more conscious thought than he had defended. He threw the heavy blow with which he'd intended to begin the fight, a simple, shoulder-level flat cut that came from behind his back and powered by the whole weight of his hips and legs, snapped around like a scythe cutting wheat. De Silva snapped his parry, a turn of the sword hand, and immediately countercut with a thrust. Aranther felt the stinging pain and the cold of the sword, and then the other man fell to the ground, clutching his neck, blood spurting into the snow and slush. De Silva gave a garbled scream, and his body arched with pain.
Before I go, I should really tell you what I'm writing now and advertise my books. I almost forgot. So my latest book is The Last Greek, which is a historical novel that is about Philopoemen of Achaia. Obviously, I strongly recommend it. I'm just about to launch into writing a new fantasy series. It's going to be set in a very different world in a time that I would best call the Bronze Age. So think Mycenae, Egypt, Sumeria. It's going to have some spectacularly different characters, very interesting sort of alien species who aren't sort of my standard tropes. But I love ancient Greece and all of that world just as much as I love the 14th century. So I'm going to try and evoke a very different fantasy world. And it's a world in which literally the gods have gone mad and something has to be done about them. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I was planning to be doing research in Greece this summer, but surprise, we're not traveling out of Canada. So I'm going to have to go on all my other visits to Mycenae. That's what I'm writing next. If you want to go to authorswithoutborders.com, you'll find what a whole bunch of people you may have heard of have written for free this summer. I wrote a whole novel for free, so did several other people like Simon Turney and Ben Kane. That's sort of what I'm doing with myself. If you have any questions, go to my website at christiancameronauthor.com and drop me a line. I am not famous enough to not answer all of my mail. Thanks.